So before we didn't really have any real state of our own within this in the application. There was a state with the router, um, but what if we wanted to show users as one of the tabs? And that would probably be in our state. In fact, the way that I've got it set up here is that I'm actually adding one more user when the component ends up mounting. And you're seeing not only in the nav the number of users starts at 2 and goes to 3, but also within the component itself. So let's talk about what has to change in order to get this to work. Let me undo my changes here. We'll be back to where we were before. And right now we've got this component that doesn't have any state related to it. Now, an easy way to turn this into a stateful component is to make this extends component. And if this is going to end up being a class, then one thing we could do here is this whole method will become our render method. So this really isn't going to change much. Let's just indent it. This should put us back in the same spot that we were before, which it does. But let's say that we did have a stateful application. So one thing that we might want to do here is that we might want to have some users. Now again, we probably end up getting our users from the server, but let's just sort of simulate it by saying this dot state equals, and we'll say users, and we'll have 2 users here. So we'll just have name is Mo, another one, Larry. And let's just log this out by going over here. And I always like to destructure this. I'm going to get users from, and let's just log it out. So we see we have 2 users, and actually let's just go over here just to make things kind of interesting. After the component mounts, let's just add another user. Again, we'll just sort of simulate something being asynchronous. We'll actually do it with a set timeout. So let's say after a second, we're going to add another user, and the way that we're going to do that is we'll say users, and we're going to splat out this dot state dot users, and we'll add a new user. And we could console log the users. But we're also going to want to set them on the state. So we're going to have to go over here and say this set state users. And we'll see the console.log happening here. So we've got 2, in another second, we end up getting 3 users. So there's a couple things that we might want to do. Let's just first add another route for our users. Let's start out by doing a little copying and pasting. And we're going to put in users. This is going to go to users. We're going to make this selected if, in fact, the path is users. And let's go up here and create this users component. For now, let's just go in here and put in users. And let's go down here, and we're going to need to add this as a route. So the path is going to be to users. The component is going to be users. And we've got our third component, which are users. But one of the things we want to do is we want to pass the users down to this component. Right now, it feels like there really is not a way to do this. I mean, what we're shooting for here is to pass as props. And again, I like to do the destructuring right here, but to pass as props users. And if I want to wrap this, don't forget, if I want to wrap this in a UL, one of the things that I need to do is it needs to be in a parent component because, again, behind the scenes, this is going to do a React create element, and it has to have a starting point. So ideally, what I'd like to do is something along the lines of using my mapping function to say, here are my users I'm going to map. For each user, I'm going to end up creating a list item, and this will be the name of the user. Close off that mapping. And ideally, that's what I'd like to do, but I'm going to run into a problem because I'm not actually passing my users. So how do I do it? Well, the way that the route works is that if I give it a component, I just name the component. And that's the easiest thing to do. But I could actually, instead of putting in the component, I could put in render. And that ends up getting passed a function. So I could define a function for render. And I could say, when you go to render, this is what I want you to do. Now, the problem that I'm going to run into, I'm going to be in the same boat that I was before. It's going to try to call render, but again, I'm not passing that data. So all I need to do to pass it is to pass it. So now, instead of putting in the component, I have a little more control over it. I say we're going to render the component, and I'm going to pass in the users. And I'll go from 2 users to 3 users. I get a little message here that I should have a unique key. I don't have an ID here for the moment, but let's make that message go away. It's just a warning, but warnings can be a little bit annoying. So I'm just going to grab the index, because it's just a regular plain old map. And I'm going to go over here and say the key here is going to be the index. And now that error ends up going away. So we're part of the way there, except it would still be great to show our users up here. Now I could try to do the same thing. So I could go over here, and I've got my nav. And what I could end up doing here is also saying, hey, look, here's my props, and on my users, I could go over here and say props.users.length. But I'm going to run into that same problem here because here's my nav component, and again, I'm not passing any users. So this ends up breaking. Well, there's actually something very interesting that we could do here. What we could do is we could tell this component to also render. And if I went over here, I could go over here and I could say, when you render nav, you also pass in the users. Sometimes it gets to be a little bit tricky here. You have to take a quick look at it. So these are the braces around render, and this is the render function that will end up getting called. So you can say, all right, I should be in pretty good shape here. But then I run into a different problem. I don't have this path name value. So let's make that error go away, and let's talk about how we can end up getting that. So I'm just going to hard code. I'll say path equals home. It's not right, but I'm just going to put it there for a second. Now if I refresh this, I won't be on the right page, but notice my users does update. I'm always showing that I'm on the home, which is not right. So how do we get both things? How do we get the properties from our router and our state or whatever else we want to pass down here? Well, what happens is that when I end up putting this callback function in for render, I get some props that get passed here. And these are basically all of the properties that you saw before for my routing. So what I could end up doing here is I could actually make this component a little bit easier to read by saying, hey, look, the path props location dot path name. So I'm actually even doing a little bit of work that my nav component had to do before. And again, the reason why this works is that when this callback function gets called, the hash routing library says, well, you might want to know these props, so I'm going to pass them to you. You do with them what you want to do. And I'm just going to basically take the location.path name and I'm going to set it here on the path. So now this is a property that comes in here. And here I could say now the path is equal to the props.path, in which case now my navigation works. And I can clean it up just a little bit by maybe doing a little destructuring here, less dots, and saying I'm being passed in the path and the users. And here, this could just be users dot length, and it'll end up working the same way. So the big takeaway here is that by using the render property of a route, we have the ability not only to pass whatever other parameters that we want to pass, but we also end up getting our routing parameters, and we could pass whatever parameters we want from that.